Well, we're going to take, for this particular lecture, we're going to take two very classic realist short stories, a couple of very famous ones. One I'm sure you've read probably before, at least heard about before, and that's Ambrose Bierce's Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. You might not have read Chopin's The Storm, partly because in high school they won't let you read that kind of thing. On the other hand, you might have read it. I don't know. You might be very familiar with Chopin. But these two writers are very, very interesting for a couple of different reasons. They serve as wonderful models for us to sort of look at what are the basics of realism as a literary movement in American literature. I want to focus on some key questions. We'll get around to each one of these, I hope, within the course of this very short commentary. You've got your notes in front of you, of course, and don't forget to participate in the discussion and answer the quiz questions about the deadlines, etc. You know the drill by this point. We'll start off with Ambrose Bierce because the style of Bierce is one of the things that really is a hallmark of his work. The characteristics and traits of this work you can see very clearly from a writer like Bierce or William Dean Howells or Samuel Clemens or all these different guys, that it's a very sort of newspapery kind of style. There's not a lot of commentary in here. It's trying for a very objective style, a very reporter-like objectivity. And you see this kind of in the tone of the work a little bit if you look at some of the sentences very carefully, that he's trying to cultivate this. Notice the kind of careful wording there, like I pointed out in the notes when he says that Peyton was engaged in being hanged. Gosh, wow, that's detached to say the least, right? There's no passion in here. It's just a straightforward narrative of what happened, who, what, when, where, how, and why kind of thing. On the other hand, though, what's interesting is that we move from phase to phase. We kind of see things at one stage. Oh, and by the way, the breaks in the story are your tip-off here. We see things at one point from Peyton's eyes, from his perspective, you see. It turns out that it's a fantasy, right? It's a desperate fantasy. He has these fantasies of heroism. He's not a heroic figure. He didn't fight in the war. He didn't really take an active part. He sees himself as some sort of great, sort of Walter Mitty hero type figure, but he isn't. In that sense, you could, as my notes point out, you could say that some of these writers like Bierce and especially Mark Twain thought very little of the Southern cause. They thought these people were all a bunch of fantasizers. They were all wrapped up in some sort of weird chivalric kind of Ivanhoe fantasy sort of thing. Some of them even thought that Southerners had read too much romantic chivalry fiction, Ivanhoe and that kind of stuff, King Arthur tales and such, and they didn't know what a real war was because we hadn't had a real war on our shores for 50 years, and even then the War of 1812 didn't last that long and wasn't in very many parts of the country. So people didn't really know what war was. These guys like Bierce went out and saw the war and saw how vicious and cruel and horrible it was. And in a way, rather than being emotional or over the top in his style, the most effective way to depict that is to be detached in a way, for you to see the horror of it. This is a fantasy that at the snap of a rope ends abruptly. He thinks he's going to escape. He hopes he's going to escape. But at the end of the story, if you're reading really carefully, you know what we're reading at certain parts of the story that's not really happening. It's just happening in Peyton's mind. And so Peyton, in a way, is a kind of an emblem of the South and its foolishness, its fantasy of winning, its fantasy of chivalry and such. And he and Twain and all these guys didn't like aristocracy much to begin with, I think. You can take a look at some of the traits and characteristics. These writers want to depict characters as they see them, not as they should be. Situations as they see them, not as they should be. You might want a guy like Peyton to swim away and avoid the bullets, and they bounced off of him, and he eluded these Yankees as he got away. I don't know, depending on what what you think of him. But it's not going to happen because it doesn't happen in life. That kind of stuff doesn't happen, right? This is nonsense. This is at the time there was no Hollywood, but we would say it's Hollywood. It doesn't happen that way. The superhuman nonsense. It's nice in fantasy, but it's not true in real life. So that's what they're striving for. What these works want to do, or what these works do, what their authors are seeking to do, is to present you life as it is, without a preset agenda. This is the way life is. I don't know whether it's good or bad that life is that way. I don't know whether it's good or bad that this is what happens to some people. But I know that choices are things that people make, and those choices lead to consequences. And those consequences can sometimes be good or they can sometimes be bad. The newly emerging art form of photography really, I think, influenced these guys a lot. Not just journalism as a profession, but also photography. To present through fiction what the photographer presents in photographs. Snapshots of real life, people as they really appear, without trying to gussy it up or sugarcoat it. That's really what they're trying to do. And they're presenting sort of with question number 3 here, the type of world where, if you run afoul of the laws of nature, if you run afoul of the way things work in the world, if you have just bad luck, stuff happens and then you die. This is not a terribly optimistic fiction. It's not the kind of fiction that makes you want to run out and say rah, rah, rah. It really is fiction that says, look, some people make it in life and some people don't. Some people make it because they're smarter and they're quicker and they're harder working. Some people don't make it despite all those things because they just had bad things happen to them. Some people walk around their whole lives dreaming and living in a fantasy world only to have that thing shut off into their face. Like Peyton at the last moment, and they die deluded. No moral to the story, just he just dies. That's all it is. Now we'll get back to whether it really is a moral or not, because I think they have a point. How can you have a theme if you in a short story if you're being totally objective? But we'll get that with item 6 here, question 6, in just a moment. With respect to Kate Chopin, okay, now you saw my four responses, 4 reactions. Which one was yours? A, B, C, or D? You have to read very carefully. This is a prime example of what I'm talking about when these guys basically don't put forward a preset moral to their story, moral agenda. There's no presupposed moral code that they feel that their characters need to live up to. People do stuff. They cheat on their husbands and wives. Now, you and I say, well, they do, Dr. Litton, but they always get caught, and they're always sad, and they're always regretful, and it always ruins their marriage. Except with Kate Chopin's The Storm, right? Now, you and I maybe, I think adultery is a really horrible thing. Don't get me wrong. But evidently, Kate Chopin says some people do this. They, quote, get away with it, unquote. And there are no bad consequences in some cases. Okay, I could argue with that, but she's presenting us a world where people do this. I mean, that one line towards the end, and the storm passed, and so everyone lived happily ever after. Look at that. Look at that. They lived happily ever after. What they don't know don't hurt them. Okay? It's a really, for those of us who have traditional values with respect to marriage, it's a really uncomfortable thing. But she's saying to her reader, which is why it's so shocking for the 19th century. My gosh, can you imagine what this must have been like for someone reading this who was a traditional, typical middle class or upper middle class Victorian American? They would have been appalled at this kind of stuff. The notion that the character doesn't get punished for adultery, they don't get caught, someone doesn't get upset, their lives aren't ruined, they just go on and they're happy. This is just not right. But Chopin is saying, look, it happens. People get away with it. Some people rob banks and they never get caught, right? But there's something more to this than that kind of is disturbing to some readers. And that is Chopin, who was in a terrible marriage. Okay, you gotta know that. Okay. The storm passed, and so everyone was happy. It's almost as though Chopin is coming right up to the line of saying, some people need to commit adultery to be happy. And there are different types of that marriage is a stifling institution, that people have to seek happiness outside of it. It's not an all the time kind of thing, it's just a kind of a fling kind of thing. When Alcée rides up, oh my gosh, he is the great hot lover of her past that she wanted to marry and couldn't, okay? There's some classic lines in here that are really very, very interesting. Um, as you go through this, he is the great love she never could have. He had a chance. If you'll read really carefully, there are certain lines. He had a chance to essentially take her virginity, and he didn't do it. This is the line: if she was not an immaculate, if she was not an immaculate dove in those days, meaning before she got before she got married, when she was dating Alcée, whom she could not marry, right? Okay, she ended up marrying her husband. If she was not an immaculate dove in those days, she wasn't? Oh, okay, so she kind of had been part of the way around the block, maybe. That's what we're talking about here. I don't know. She was still inviolate. I read that to say she still had her virginity. A passionate creature whose very defenselessness had made her defense, against which his honor forbade him to prevail. Now, think what you want of Alcée, okay? This is a moment of passion. This wasn't premeditated, unless maybe it was on a subconscious level, right? Think what you want about Alcée. Before they got married, he did not press things too far with her, because he knew what the consequences would be, that he was a man of honor and would not do that to her, okay? That was important today, people have different views, but at the time, boy, that was a really important thing, that a woman retain her virginity. He didn't do that. But then you see that now they're kind of free to do the deed, right? And no harm, no foul is the kind of view that is being put forward here, at least in their minds. It's not a thing that they're premeditating again, but it's a thing that really, the circumstances happen. Of course, the storm, gosh, you'd have to be brain dead not to see all the storm and is mirroring the sexual tension and the crashing and the thundering and all this kind of stuff. Gosh, Freud would have just a field day with this, wouldn't he? But it's really, notice the other line that I think is so important in here. Very, very important, about her birthright, okay? Knowing for her birthright for the first time. And that is Calixta's body was knowing for the first time its birthright. What is its birthright? I think as a woman, Kate Chopin is saying, her sexuality is her birthright. What's a birthright? It's a thing that you're entitled to from birth. It's your inheritance, right? Remember the story, if you know the biblical story, of Jacob and Esau, right? Esau had a birthright. He was firstborn, so he was entitled to something by birth, right? That's your birthright. What is her birthright? And I think Chopin is saying sexuality, sexual pleasure. There's nothing to be ashamed about with that. And the women in the Victorian era, there was a very, very oppressive kind of culture with respect to that. Women weren't supposed to be sexual creatures, but Chopin, I think to her credit, is saying they are, and that it's not a thing that a woman should be ashamed of. It's a thing that on the other hand, you and I might come out and say, well, yeah, but it's not something that they should be engaged in outside of the marriage vows. What types of characters are these? These are everyday characters. These are not. One's a hero wannabe, but he's no hero. What determines the outcome of the story? Is it chance? Is it just the circumstances that they run into? At every point, characters have choices, and the choices matter. Sometimes it is chance. Sometimes it's just really bad luck. The question I want you to ponder, and we'll pick this up in the discussion section if you want to, is the question of whether literature of any kind can ever be objective. These guys are shooting for objectivity in literature, but can it be objective? I mean, as a writer, you're the one who writes the script. You're the one that creates the characters and puts them in the circumstances. And if you don't have an agenda, if you don't have a point, then your story is just a collection of facts and doesn't have a theme to it, does it? I mean, why did you write this, Ambrose Bierce? Why did you write this, Kate Chopin? It must be because you were trying to communicate some point to the reader. A point is ipso facto an agenda, isn't it? And if something has an agenda, then how can it be said to be objective? It's an interesting philosophical point, but I want you to think about this. Is realism, the goals of realism, the way that these writers set it up, even actually philosophically possible? Or are they just engaged in kind of a mental exercise that amuses themselves and tries to achieve something that you can't achieve in literature, and that is complete detachment, complete objectivity. After all, you choose to write something. Why did you write it? What would your point be?